Imagine living in a world where justice was not carried out in quiet courtrooms, but in open streets and public squares, where the punishment was not only about correcting a crime, but about sending a message to everyone who watched. Medieval punishments were not only brutal, but deeply symbolic, and they reveal a great deal about how people in the Middle Ages thought about law, morality, and society itself. Tonight, we'll step into that world and explore the strange, terrifying, and sometimes almost unbelievable ways justice was served in medieval times. From the humiliation of the stocks to the horrors of the gallows, these stories will take you back to an age where punishment was not hidden, but displayed as part of daily life. Before we begin, if you find yourself enjoying this journey through the past, I'd love for you to subscribe to this channel, History for Sleep. Subscribing helps you never miss a new story, and it also lets me know that people like you want more relaxing history to drift off to. While you're here, let me know in the comments what kinds of history you'd like to listen to. Are you more interested in medieval life, in ancient empires, or perhaps in the daily routines of people long ago? And let me know when you like to listen, whether it's as you're falling asleep, during a quiet evening, or on a calm morning walk. Your thoughts help guide what stories I share next. So now, let's settle in, let the world outside grow quiet, and step back into the Middle Ages, where punishments were not just about crime, but about power, belief, and survival. As we move through these chapters, I'll unfold not only the punishments themselves, but also the culture and fears that created them. By the end, you'll see how these harsh and often shocking practices reflected the values of the time, and perhaps understand why such extremes felt necessary in a world so different from our own. The Middle Ages were a time when law and order were not kept by professional police forces or elaborate legal codes as we think of them today. Instead, justice was often local, immediate, and deeply entwined with the beliefs of the community. Medieval society was shaped by hierarchy, religion, and survival. Crimes were not seen merely as offenses against individuals, but as disruptions of the natural and divine order. Because of this, punishments often carried not just practical consequences, but symbolic weight. To understand what medieval punishments looked like, it is important first to picture the world in which they existed. A world where survival was fragile, power was concentrated, and justice was not about fairness as much as it was about deterrence and control. For most medieval people, life revolved around their village, manor, or town. The presence of authority was often represented by the local lord, in larger settlements, by city officials and guild leaders. Law was unevenly applied, and the wealthy had far more protection than the poor. Still, there was a shared sense that crime needed to be addressed quickly and dramatically. Punishment was not only for the wrongdoer, it was meant to teach everyone who watched. This is why many punishments took place in public squares or at crossroads, where as many people as possible could see them. The spectacle of justice reinforced the power of rulers and reminded ordinary people of their place within the social and moral order. Religion played an enormous role in shaping medieval justice. The Church taught that sin and crime were often intertwined, and that suffering could serve as penance for wrongdoing. The idea of purifying the soul through pain was not unusual. In fact, many punishments were designed with both earthly correction and spiritual salvation in mind. A thief might be flogged not only to discourage further stealing, but also to cleanse him of sin in the eyes of God. Heresy, which was seen as an offense not just against rulers, but against the very foundation of the faith, could bring the harshest punishments, because it was thought to endanger not only the heretic's soul, but also the souls of those who might be influenced by their ideas. Another factor shaping punishment was fear. Communities in the Middle Ages lived with constant anxiety, fear of famine, of disease, of invasion, and of disorder. Anything that seemed to threaten stability was taken very seriously. A crime was not just an individual act. It could be seen as a crack in the fragile balance that held society together. This is why punishments were often extreme. A harsh penalty for a single theft, for example, was not only about that one thief, it was a warning that no one should dare disturb the delicate order of life in the community. Because central governments were often weak or limited in their reach, local communities relied on traditional forms of justice. In villages, disputes might be settled by the lord of the manor or by a council of elders. In towns, there were sometimes rudimentary courts, but the procedures were very different from what we think of as fair trials today. Evidence could be sparse, witnesses unreliable, and the outcome often depended on the social standing of the accused. To make up for this uncertainty, punishments had to be visible and memorable. They served as a kind of reinforcement in a system where formal law was fragile. Punishments were also deeply symbolic. Medieval people lived in a world rich with imagery and allegory. A punishment was often designed not just to inflict pain, but to send a message. A liar might have his tongue pierced. A thief could lose a hand. A traitor might be torn apart to show how betrayal split apart the very fabric of society. These acts of symbolic justice reinforced the moral lessons taught by the Church and ensured that punishments were remembered long after they occurred. They were more than penalties. They were performances of morality, staged for the entire community. It is also important to remember that not all punishments were violent or physical. While torture and execution are the most shocking to modern ears, there were many other ways justice was enforced. Public shaming, fines, or being forced to perform humiliating tasks were also common. These punishments might sound less severe, but in the tightly knit world of a medieval village, where reputation was everything, public humiliation could be devastating. To be locked in the stocks where your neighbors could laugh, jeer, or throw food at you was to suffer a wound to your social standing that might never fully heal. The brutality of medieval justice shocks us today, but in the context of the time, it made a kind of sense. Without police forces, prisons, or widespread systems of surveillance, the community relied on punishment as both deterrence and spectacle. A single execution might discourage countless crimes. A flogging in the town square could remind people for weeks of the dangers of stepping out of line. Justice was not hidden behind walls. It was displayed for all to see, a part of the social fabric itself. As we move deeper into the world of medieval punishments, it is helpful to hold this context in mind. The punishments may sound horrifying, but to medieval people, they were both familiar and necessary. They reflected the values of the age, a belief in hierarchy, a reliance on spectacle, and a constant fear of disorder. Justice was harsh because life itself was harsh, and punishments were one of the few tools society had to protect itself from the chaos that always seemed close at hand. In this opening chapter, we begin to see how punishment was not just about crime, but about power, belief, and survival. It was a way of binding communities together, reminding them of the rules they lived by, and warning them of the costs of disobedience. In the chapters to come, we will explore the specific punishments themselves, beginning with one of the most fascinating and strange systems of justice, the trials by ordeal, where guilt or innocence was decided not by evidence or argument, but by firewater and faith. When we think about justice today, we imagine careful investigations, lawyers presenting evidence, and judges weighing the facts. But in the medieval world, proof was often far harder to come by. Witnesses could be unreliable, records were scarce, and science as we know, it simply didn't exist. Instead of building cases through evidence, many medieval communities turned to something they believed was far more reliable, the judgment of God. If humans could not determine the truth, then surely the divine could. Out of this belief grew the practice of trial by ordeal, a series of tests in which the accused was subjected to physical challenges, believed to reveal guilt or innocence through divine intervention. The most common ordeals involved fire and water. The ordeal of fire required the accused to carry a red-hot iron bar or to plunge a hand into boiling water. Afterward, the wound would be bandaged, and in the days that followed, priests or officials would examine how it healed. If it healed cleanly, the person was declared innocent, for God had clearly protected them. If it became infected or failed to heal properly, that was taken as a sign of guilt. To modern eyes, it seems impossible to imagine that anyone could be judged in such a way. But in an age when faith was deeply woven into daily life, the logic was powerful. Illness or injury was often interpreted as a punishment from God, so it seemed natural that divine will would be revealed through a wound. The ordeal of water was perhaps even more striking. In this trial, the accused would be bound and lowered into a body of water, often a river or pond. The belief was that water, as a pure and sacred element, would accept the innocent and reject the guilty. If the accused sank, they were considered innocent. If they floated, it was seen as a sign that the water had rejected them, marking them as guilty. The tragic irony was that sinking often meant drowning, so an innocent person might lose their life, even as they were declared free of sin. To those who carried out the ordeal, however, it was not cruelty. It was the unfolding of divine justice. Other ordeals existed as well. In some cases, people were made to swallow pieces of bread or cheese while under the watchful eye of priests. If they choked, it was believed they were guilty. This was called the ordeal of morsel, and it played upon the belief that God would prevent the innocent from coming to harm in such a simple act. There were also ordeals in which combat decided the outcome. Trial by combat, often romanticized in stories, was based on the idea that God would grant victory to the innocent. Two men would fight, sometimes to the death, and the survivor would be declared justified. Though this may sound like nothing more than violence, it was viewed as sacred violence, carried out under the eye of heaven. For medieval people, these ordeals were not senseless brutality. They were a way of making the invisible visible, of allowing divine power to speak when human judgment could not. It is important to remember that most people of the time lived in a world where God's will was thought to shape every moment of existence. Crops failed or flourished because of divine favor. Illnesses struck as punishment or as trials of faith, and wars were believed to be judged by the heavens. Within such a worldview, it seemed only natural that guilt or innocence could be revealed through ordeals. If the accused suffered or perished, it was understood as a just outcome, for surely God would not allow the innocent to be condemned. Yet not everyone was fully comfortable with the ordeals. By the later Middle Ages, even some church leaders began to question the practice, especially as medical knowledge began to grow and as doubts about the fairness of these trials spread. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council, one of the great gatherings of the medieval church, officially forbade clergy from participating in ordeals. This effectively ended many of the traditional practices. Though the spirit behind them, belief in God's direct hand in justice, remained strong. Communities still sought signs, omens, and divine indications when dealing with crime, even if the physical ordeals themselves faded away. The ordeals also highlight the importance of community belief in shaping justice. These trials were performed before large gatherings, where villagers or townspeople could watch and see God's judgment unfold. The crowd's belief in the legitimacy of the ordeal was as important as the outcome itself. If everyone accepted that God had spoken through the test, then the punishment or acquittal carried real weight. In this way, ordeals were as much about reinforcing shared faith and community trust as they were about determining individual guilt. Looking back now, we can see that trial by ordeal reveals just how different the medieval mindset was from our own. To us, it seems irrational and unfair, but to them, it was a system deeply grounded in their worldview, one that combined justice with the sacred, punishment with purification, and judgment with divine power. It also shows the medieval desire for certainty in a world that was often unpredictable and dangerous. The ordeal gave people a sense that, no matter how unclear the evidence, the truth could still be revealed by a higher power. In many ways, the ordeals were theatrical. designed not only to test the accused, but to remind the community of the ever-present role of God. The glowing iron, the boiling water, the still surface of the pond, each became a stage with a drama of divine justice played out. For the medieval mind, the very act of witnessing such ordeals was a spiritual experience, reinforcing belief and binding the community together in shared awe and fear. As we move from the ordeals into other punishments, we will see how this blend of spectacle, symbolism, and fear continued to shape medieval justice. The ordeals may have been outlawed, but the need for public displays of punishment remained. And nowhere is that more clear than in the punishments that relied on shame and humiliation, the next chapter in our journey into the world of medieval justice. Not every medieval punishment was designed to maim or kill. Some of the most common, and in many ways the most memorable, were punishments of shame. In the tightly woven communities of the Middle Ages, reputation was everything. To be trusted, to be known as honest, to maintain good standing in the eyes of one's neighbors, these were as valuable as coin or land. A punishment that damaged a person's public image could leave scars every bit as deep as physical pain. And so, the use of stocks and pillories became widespread across medieval towns and villages, providing a way for communities to discipline wrongdoers while also reinforcing social order through public humiliation. The stocks and the pillory are often confused, but they were distinct devices. Stocks were typically low wooden frames with holes in which a person's ankles, or sometimes wrists, would be locked. The offender would sit, unable to move freely, forced to endure the gaze and mockery of passers-by. The pillory, on the other hand, was a standing wooden frame with holes for the head and hands. The person was placed upright, their body bent forward, completely exposed to the scrutiny and ridicule of the community. Both were usually placed in prominent public spaces, such as a marketplace or town square, ensuring that as many people as possible would witness the punishment. The purpose was not only to punish the offender, but to turn them into a spectacle, a living warning of what could happen to those who broke the rules. Merchants, travelers, and neighbors alike could stop, point, and jeer. Some towns even allowed or encouraged bystanders to throw rotten food, mud, or even stones at the person confined. This created a communal experience in which justice was not simply administered by officials, but enacted by the community itself. The shame was magnified by the fact that everyone, from children to elders, could participate in the punishment, cementing the idea that crime brought not just personal suffering, but public disgrace. The crimes that led to time in the stocks or pillory were often considered petty by modern standards. Drunkenness, swearing, cheating in trade, or spreading gossip could all lead to such punishments. Petty theft, slander, or even simple disobedience of local rules might earn someone a humiliating display. In some cases, the punishment was tailored to the crime in ways that heightened the symbolism. A baker caught selling underweight loaves might be displayed in the pillory with a loaf tied around his neck. A liar might have his tongue mocked or symbolically pierced while being ridiculed. The punishment was not just about discomfort. It was a theatrical reminder of the offense. For the person confined, the experience was often agonizing. Not only were they subjected to ridicule, but being locked in an unnatural position for hours caused physical pain. Muscles cramped, joints stiffened, and the inability to shield oneself from the weather could lead to exhaustion and illness. If the crowd grew especially hostile, the punishment could turn violent, with stones and sharp objects causing real injuries. What began as public shaming could sometimes end in death if the crowd's anger boiled over. Officials often walked a fine line, using humiliation as a deterrent while trying to avoid outright bloodshed. Despite the cruelty of the stocks and pillories, they had certain advantages in the eyes of medieval authorities. They were relatively inexpensive to build and maintain. They did not require the resources of imprisonment or the finality of execution. They allowed communities to enforce discipline without removing individuals permanently from society. Most importantly, they created a visible display of justice, one that reinforced the power of the law and reminded everyone watching of the costs of disobedience. In a world where literacy was limited, such visual lessons were far more effective than written decrees or warnings. For many offenders, the stigma of being placed in the stocks or pillory lingered long after the punishment ended. Neighbors would remember, and reputations could be permanently damaged. In a society where trust was essential for trade, farming, and survival, being known as someone who had been publicly shamed could lead to lasting consequences. Families might feel the weight of disgrace just as heavily as the offender, and in some cases, people never fully recovered their standing. Thus, the punishment was both temporary and enduring, a single event that could mark a life forever. The cultural significance of the stocks and pillory extended beyond simple discipline. They reflected the medieval belief in justice as a communal act. Punishment was not hidden away in prisons, but brought into the heart of daily life, where everyone could see and participate. They also reflected the idea that shame was a powerful tool of control, one that could mold behavior as effectively as fear of pain. In this way, public humiliation functioned as both punishment and performance, a ritual that reinforced the values of the community while entertaining, warning, and teaching all at once. As the centuries passed, stocks and pillories remained fixtures of public life, even into the early modern period. Their endurance speaks to how deeply the logic of public shame was ingrained in society. While we may recoil at the thought today, medieval communities saw them as practical, effective, and even necessary. The laughter and jeers of the crowd were not simply cruelty. They were part of a system that bound the community together, ensuring that everyone knew the rules and the consequences of breaking them. With this chapter, we see that medieval justice was not always about blood and violence, but also about reputation and fear of disgrace. For many people, the terror of losing honor in front of neighbors could be worse than the lash of a whip. In the next chapter, however, we move from the humiliating spectacle of the stocks to a harsher form of physical punishment, flogging and whipping, where the body itself became the canvas upon which justice was written in pain. If shame and humiliation were powerful tools of medieval justice, pain was an equally common one. Few punishments were as widespread, simple, and immediate as flogging and whipping. To be whipped was to have your body made into a warning, each lash leaving marks that told a story of wrongdoing. Unlike execution, which ended life, or imprisonment, which required resources, flogging was swift, effective, and inexpensive. It could be carried out almost anywhere, from the town square to the courtyard of a manor, and it left no question about the authority of those who wielded the whip. Whipping served many purposes in medieval society. It could be used as a punishment for theft, drunkenness, disobedience, or countless petty crimes. It was also sometimes used within institutions like schools, monasteries, and armies as a form of discipline. In these cases, the idea was not simply to punish, but to train, to correct behavior through the sharp memory of pain. To medieval minds, the whip carried moral weight. Just as parents chastised children for their missteps, so too did rulers or officials chastise wrongdoers, seeing the lashes as both correction and a form of purification. The act of flogging was often public. The condemned would be stripped to the waist, tied to a post, or bound against a wall, and then struck with rods, switches, or whips. Each blow echoed not only against the flesh, but through the gathered crowd, reinforcing the lesson that crime had consequences. The sound of the whip, the sight of blood, and the cries of the punished created a spectacle that etched itself into memory. For those watching, the pain of one became the warning for many. For the one suffering, the pain was a physical reminder of authority that could not be ignored. Different communities had their own variations. In some towns, specific numbers of lashes were prescribed for particular crimes. A thief might receive 20 lashes, while a drunkard might be given fewer. In some cases, the whipping continued until blood was drawn, ensuring that the punishment was both visible and severe. In monasteries, self-flagellation was even practiced voluntarily as an act of penance, showing that pain was seen not only as punishment, but as a path to spiritual cleansing. Within this worldview, suffering was not meaningless. It was a means of correction for the body and the soul alike. Though flogging may seem straightforward, its effects were profound. A flogged back or shoulders bore scars for weeks, sometimes for life. These marks could serve as long-term reminders of shame, visible signs that a person had once stood in the place of punishment. For those who endured it, the memory of the lash could linger in nightmares and fears, shaping behavior long after the punishment had ended. And for the community, the memory of seeing others whipped helped keep boundaries clear. Fear of the lash was often enough to prevent many from crossing lines they might otherwise have tested. The cruelty of flogging was undeniable, but it was also, in the eyes of medieval society, practical. It was faster and less expensive than long imprisonment, less final than execution, and yet still highly effective in deterring crime. In a world where resources were scarce and law enforcement limited, it provided a tool of immediate justice. The whip could be carried by an official, a soldier, or even a town crier, and punishment could be administered without delay. Its simplicity ensured its ubiquity, making it one of the most common experiences of medieval justice for ordinary people. At the same time, the symbolic power of flogging cannot be overlooked. To be whipped was to be humbled, to be brought low in the eyes of neighbors. The sight of bare flesh struck again and again was a vivid performance of authority. The whip itself became a symbol of control, feared not only for the pain it caused, but for what it represented: the absolute power of rulers, judges, or masters over the bodies of those beneath them. To resist was to risk more lashes. To endure was to submit to the social order. Either way, the punishment reinforced the balance of power. For many medieval people, watching a flogging was both frightening and strangely reassuring. It reminded them that the rules of society were enforced, that order was maintained, and that wrongdoing had consequences. In a world where chaos often felt close at hand, where famine, war, and disease could strike at any moment, such displays of order carried comfort as well as terror. Justice was seen to be done, and the world felt, if only for a moment, a little more stable. Whipping also carried with it a moral lesson. Pain was believed to cleanse, to burn away sin. Just as ordeals sought God's judgment through fire and water, so flogging carried a sense of purification. Each lash was not only punishment but penance, each drop of blood a sign of wrong repaid. This blending of punishment with moral and religious meaning made the whip more than just a tool of pain. It became an instrument of correction for the soul itself. In this way, flogging reflects the broader themes of medieval justice: its reliance on spectacle, its intertwining with religion, and its belief in punishment as both correction and warning. It was harsh, but it was also deeply symbolic, a performance that reinforced community values while leaving lasting scars on the body and spirit of the punished. And as we move forward, we see that punishment could grow even more permanent, not only inflicting pain, but leaving indelible marks upon the body. The next chapter takes us into the world of branding and mutilation, where punishment became not just temporary suffering, but a lifelong badge of shame. If flogging left scars that might fade over time, branding and mutilation were punishments that marked a person for life. These punishments were intended not only to discipline the wrongdoer, but to transform their very body into a visible record of their crime. In a society where memory was short and written records scarce, the body itself became the most reliable document. A branded mark or missing limb told a story that no one could mistake, ensuring that punishment continued long after the sentence was carried out. Branding was perhaps the most common of these permanent punishments. Using heated irons, officials would press a symbol or letter into the flesh of the convicted, often on the hand, face, or shoulder places, where the mark could be seen by all. A thief might be branded with the letter T, while other crimes had their own symbols. In some cases, the mark was not only a scar, but a literal warning, as if the body of the criminal had been turned into a living signpost of wrongdoing. To carry such a mark was to live permanently under suspicion, forever separated from the trust of the community. Mutilation carried an even more severe weight. Thieves, for instance, might lose a hand, the very tool of their crime. Liars might face the piercing or removal of their tongue. Traitors could lose their ears, noses, or other parts of their bodies. These punishments were symbolic as much as they were practical. The removal of a hand declared that the thief would never steal again, while the loss of a tongue silenced deceit. Each act carried a message. Crime corrupts the body, and justice restores balance by reshaping it. To medieval people, this was not simply cruelty, but a logical extension of the crime itself. The mutilated body served as a visible, permanent reminder of guilt. Unlike the temporary humiliation of the stocks or the fleeting pain of the lash, mutilation followed a person wherever they went. They could not escape it, for it was written on their skin and bone. A missing hand made labor more difficult. Branding made hiding from one's past impossible. These punishments effectively created a permanent class of outcasts, those who could never fully re-enter the life of the community because their bodies carried undeniable proof of their crimes. The psychological weight of branding and mutilation was immense. To live each day knowing that your body displayed your shame to the world was to suffer a punishment far greater than the moment of pain itself. It shaped how others looked at you, how you were treated, and even how you thought of yourself. Families, too, bore the weight, for the dishonor of a branded or mutilated member often extended to kin. Medieval communities were tightly bound by reputation, and a mark of shame could ripple through generations, ensuring that the punishment outlasted even the person who bore it. Religious meaning was also attached to these practices. Just as saints bore the marks of martyrdom, criminals bore the marks of crime. To some, mutilation and branding were a kind of moral justice, an outward manifestation of the inward corruption of sin. By altering the body, authorities claimed to restore balance between crime and order, making visible what had been hidden. In this sense, the punishment was as much about symbolism as it was about control. The scar, the missing hand, or the burned letter became a sermon in flesh, teaching others to avoid the same path. Branding and mutilation were also effective tools of deterrence. In marketplaces, on farms, or in city streets, the sight of someone with a branded mark or missing limb reminded others of the costs of disobedience. Fear was a constant companion in the medieval world, and these visible warnings kept that fear alive. They were living examples of what could happen when one strayed from the rules. In this way, punishment extended beyond the individual to become part of the social fabric, woven into the daily life of the community. Yet, these punishments also raised challenges. A mutilated person often struggled to survive, unable to work or earn a living. This could create problems for the community, as those marked might turn to further crime out of desperation. Some rulers began to see the disadvantages of mutilation, recognizing that permanent marks of shame could make reintegration impossible. Over time, other punishments, such as imprisonment, began to replace branding and mutilation, though the marks of the past remained on those who had already endured them. Despite these challenges, branding and mutilation remained important tools of medieval justice for centuries. They reflected a society that valued visible, symbolic punishment, one that believed crime must be made plain for all to see. In a world where memory was short and written records limited, the body became the most reliable canvas for justice. And though to modern eyes these punishments seemed barbaric, they made sense in a society where deterrence and spectacle mattered as much as fairness. As we leave behind the world of permanent marks, we turn to punishments that push the human body to its limits in another way, through devices of torture designed to stretch, tear, and break the body itself. The next chapter explores the infamous rack, a machine that became one of the most terrifying symbols of medieval punishment and the extreme measures used to extract confessions or enforce obedience. Among the many images that come to mind when people think of medieval punishment, the rack stands out as one of the most feared and infamous. This device, simple in design but devastating in effect, became a symbol of the terrifying extremes to which justice could go. Unlike punishments meant for immediate humiliation or permanent marking, the rack was often used to extract confessions, to force admissions of guilt, or to gather information. In an age when truth was thought to be hidden deep within the soul, the rack was the brutal tool designed to drag it out by force. The rack was a large wooden frame with rollers at either end. The accused was tied by the wrists and ankles, and as the rollers were turned, the ropes tightened, stretching the body in unnatural ways. At first, the tension caused pain and dislocation of joints. As the turning continued, muscles tore, ligaments snapped, and bones might break under the strain. The victim could be pulled until their body was grotesquely elongated, sometimes by several inches. The sheer agony of the process was often enough to break the will of even the strongest, compelling them to say whatever their tormentors demanded. To medieval authorities, the rack was not simply a device of cruelty, but a means of uncovering truth. The belief was that criminals or traitors often concealed their guilt, and torture provided a way to strip away lies. In particular, accusations of treason, heresy, or conspiracy were often pursued with the rack, for these crimes were seen as threats not just to individuals, but to the entire order of society. To those in power, the suffering of one was justified if it protected the many from betrayal or unrest. The experience of the rack was not only physical, but psychological. To be bound to the device, to see the rollers waiting, to hear the creak of the wood as the ropes tightened, this alone was enough to instill terror. Sometimes the mere threat of the rack was used to gain confessions. The sight of others being stretched could also terrify prisoners into obedience. In this way, the rack functioned not only as a tool of torture, but as a symbol of authority, a reminder of the ultimate power rulers held over the bodies and lives of their subjects. Reports of the rack's use spread widely, magnifying its reputation. Prisoners who survived carried the marks of dislocation and broken joints for the rest of their lives. Tales of its horrors circulated in villages and towns, feeding the collective imagination of cruelty. Whether every story was true or not mattered little. The image of the rack became so powerful that it lived on as a kind of legend, shaping how people thought of justice and authority. For many, it symbolized the terrifying reach of the law, a force capable of tearing a person apart to protect order. It is worth noting that the rack was not used everywhere or by everyone in medieval Europe. Its use was often concentrated in places where central authorities sought to maintain tight control, such as in royal courts or during inquisitions. Nonetheless, the stories of its horrors traveled far, ensuring that even those who never saw one in person feared its power. Its reputation was often greater than its actual use, which in itself shows how punishment in the Middle Ages relied as much on fear and spectacle as on the punishments themselves. To modern eyes, the rack may seem like the ultimate example of barbarity, but within the medieval context, it was seen as a necessary evil. Confession was often valued above all else, seen as the ultimate proof of guilt and a way to resolve uncertainty. If someone confessed under torture, the authorities could claim divine confirmation, for God would not allow an innocent person to lie under such duress, or so they believed. In this way, the rack reflected the deep intertwining of faith, authority, and pain that defined medieval justice. At the same time, the rack highlights a theme common to many medieval punishments: the transformation of the human body into a message. Stretching and tearing the body was not only about inflicting suffering, but about showing the reach of power. The body was the canvas, and the pain written upon it was meant to speak to all who heard the story. In this sense, the rack was as much a performance of authority as it was an act of interrogation. The memory of the rack has lingered for centuries, long after its actual use began to fade. It remains one of the most enduring symbols of medieval cruelty, a device that, whether used often or rarely, captured the imagination and fear of generations. Its very name evokes images of suffering and power, proof that the medieval world wielded punishment not only as discipline, but as a reminder of how fragile the human body is in the face of authority. As we move forward, we will encounter other devices and punishments whose fame may owe more to legend than reality. The next chapter explores one of the most notorious of all, the Iron Maiden, a supposed coffin of spikes that has haunted imaginations for centuries, though its true history is more complex than the myths suggest. Few images of medieval punishment are as chilling as the Iron Maiden, a tall, coffin-like structure lined with spikes, into which a victim could be shut, their body pierced as the doors closed. For centuries, the Iron Maiden has been presented as the very symbol of medieval cruelty, a device that turned death into slow agony. But when we peel back the layers of legend, we find that the truth is more complicated. The Iron Maiden, as most people imagine it today, may not have been a genuine medieval invention at all, but rather a later creation built upon stories and fears of medieval punishment. The first descriptions of devices resembling the Iron Maiden do not appear in medieval sources, but in accounts written centuries later. Historians believe that the concept may have been retroactively imagined during the Renaissance or even in the 18th and 19th centuries, when fascination with the so-called Dark Ages was at its peak. Museums displayed Iron Maidens as gruesome relics, drawing crowds who marveled at the supposed barbarity of the Middle Ages. Yet modern scholars have shown that many of these displays were assembled from older pieces of armor, torture devices, or coffins, cobbled together to create a spectacle that fed the imagination more than it reflected historical reality. Still, even if the Iron Maiden was more myth than fact, it resonated deeply with the fears and values of the medieval world. The idea of being trapped in a metal shell, pierced and held immobile, spoke to the same themes that shaped genuine punishments: the loss of control over the body, the use of pain to enforce obedience, and the public fascination with suffering as a moral lesson. In this sense, the Iron Maiden, whether real or not, captured the spirit of medieval justice, which relied as much on imagination and fear as it did on actual practice. Part of what makes the Iron Maiden such a powerful symbol is its theatricality. It was not merely a tool of pain, but a stage upon which punishment could be dramatized. To be enclosed in such a device was to be swallowed by metal, to vanish from the sight of the crowd, and yet remain in their imagination. The spikes made suffering inevitable, and the coffin-like shape evoked burial, suggesting that the punishment was as much about erasing the person as it was about killing them. Even if no medieval executioner ever used such a machine, the stories told about it reinforced the sense that medieval punishment was capable of the most extreme horrors. It is also important to understand why myths like the Iron Maiden flourished. By the time these stories were popularized, the Middle Ages were often remembered as an age of ignorance and brutality, a convenient contrast for later societies that wanted to see themselves as enlightened and advanced. Tales of Iron Maidens, dungeons, and cruel devices served to paint the past as a dark mirror, a place so terrible that the present seemed all the brighter. In this way, the myth of the Iron Maiden tells us not only about medieval punishments, but also about how later generations used the idea of the Middle Ages for their own purposes. Yet, while the Iron Maiden itself may not have been a real medieval punishment, the fascination with it reflects something very real: the central role of fear and imagination in justice. Medieval punishments were often exaggerated in the telling, their horrors magnified to ensure that the lesson was remembered. Whether through the ordeal of fire, the spectacle of the pillory, or the scars of branding, the aim was always the same: to leave an impression so strong that it could not be forgotten. The Iron Maiden, real or not, fits perfectly into this tradition, a story so vivid that it lived on in the minds of people long after the Middle Ages had passed. For those who lived in the medieval world, the possibility of terrible punishments was always present, whether or not every device we imagine actually existed. Fear was a powerful deterrent, and the stories of what might happen were often as effective as the punishments themselves. The Iron Maiden may have been a legend, but legends can shape behavior just as much as reality. To believe in the existence of such cruelty was to feel the weight of authority pressing down, even if no iron spikes ever touched the skin. As we move beyond the myths, we return to punishments that were very real and very common, carried out in marketplaces and fields across medieval Europe. The gallows, the simple structure of wood and rope, became one of the most enduring symbols of justice. In the next chapter, we explore the practice of hanging, a punishment that was both ordinary and deeply symbolic, a spectacle that united communities in fear, order, and the finality of death. Among the many punishments of the medieval world, none was as common or as symbolic as hanging. The gallows' simple wooden beams with ropes dangling were a familiar sight in towns and villages across Europe. Hanging was not only practical, but also deeply theatrical, a punishment that combined efficiency with spectacle. It could be performed almost anywhere, required little preparation, and left the body of the condemned on display as a lasting warning. For centuries, the gallows stood as a grim reminder that the power of law and authority could end a life with a single drop. Hanging was used for a wide range of crimes, from theft to treason. In many cases, it was the default punishment for serious offenses that did not merit more elaborate forms of execution. The process itself was stark and chillingly simple. A rope was placed around the neck of the condemned, and with a push or a trapdoor release, they were left to fall. Death came either quickly, through a broken neck, or slowly, through strangulation. In either case, the sight of the body suspended above the ground carried enormous weight. To the medieval mind, it was a vivid symbol of the severing of life, a reminder that justice, once pronounced, could not be escaped. The gallows were often placed in prominent locations, at crossroads, on hillsides, or near town gates, ensuring maximum visibility. Travelers passing by would see the stark outline of the structure, sometimes with bodies still hanging, swaying in the wind. This constant reminder reinforced the authority of rulers and the consequences of disobedience. In some places, gallows became landmarks, their presence so permanent that they were etched into the landscape, both physically and in memory. The execution ground was not hidden away, but made part of daily life, a place where people gathered to witness justice unfold. The act of execution was itself a kind of ritual. Crowds gathered, officials read the charges, and priests urged the condemned to confess and repent. The moment before the drop was filled with tension, as onlookers watched to see whether the prisoner would display fear, anger, or acceptance. For many, the execution was not only about punishment, but about moral drama. A criminal who repented at the gallows was seen as an example of God's mercy, while one who cursed or defied authority was taken as a warning of damnation. Either way, the execution became a story retold in taverns, homes, and marketplaces for years to come. Sometimes, hanging was combined with other punishments. Bodies might be left on display long after death, serving as food for birds and a grim symbol of decay. In cases of treason, the body might be taken down and further mutilated, divided into parts that were displayed in different locations. These gruesome additions were not merely cruelty, they were messages of power, making clear that betrayal or crime against authority would be met with the harshest consequences. The body of the condemned became a tool of communication, speaking to everyone who saw it long after the execution was over. For those who watched, The gallows carried mixed emotions. There was fear, of course, but also curiosity and even a sense of entertainment. In a world with few diversions, public executions became social events, drawing crowds from far and wide. Vendors sold food, children climbed for a better view, and neighbors gossiped about the crimes and fate of the condemned. Justice was not carried out behind closed doors, but in full view of the community, reinforcing the idea that law was a shared experience, one in which all took part as witnesses. The gallows thus served both as punishment and as public theater. The symbolism of hanging also extended into the spiritual realm. The rope around the neck was seen as a sign of shame, a visible acknowledgement of guilt. To be suspended between heaven and earth was to be caught between worlds, rejected by society and awaiting judgment from God. Priests often urged the condemned to confess before death, emphasizing the hope of salvation even in the final moment. For medieval audiences, this blend of earthly justice and spiritual reckoning gave executions a profound weight. They were not just punishments, they were lessons about life, death, and the fate of the soul. Despite its common use, hanging could be unpredictable. Sometimes the rope broke, or the drop was too short, leading to prolonged suffering. In some cases, crowds or officials intervened, either out of mercy or because they believed the mishap was a sign of divine intervention. Such moments added drama to the ritual, reminding all present that even in the carefully orchestrated world of execution, fate and faith still had their roles to play. These accidents were often interpreted as messages, reinforcing the belief that God's hand guided even the harshest acts of justice. Over time, hanging became more refined, with techniques designed to ensure swifter deaths. But in the medieval period, the crudeness of the method was part of its impact. The slow strangulation, the twitching body, the silence that followed, all of it combined to create a lasting impression. To those who saw it, the memory was etched deeply, serving as a constant reminder of the costs of crime. The gallows did not just end lives. They shaped the way people thought about law, authority, and morality itself. As we step away from the gallows, we move into another form of execution that carried a very different weight: beheading. Considered a more noble death, it was often reserved for those of higher rank, a punishment that was swift, symbolic, and laden with meaning about honor, power, and social status. In the next chapter, we explore how the axe and the sword became instruments of justice, and how beheading reflected both the brutality and the hierarchy of the medieval world. In the hierarchy of medieval punishments, beheading occupied a strange and significant place. Unlike hanging, which was seen as the commoner's death, beheading was reserved for those of higher status nobles, knights, or those whose social standing demanded a punishment that was both severe and dignified. To lose one's head was still to lose one's life, but it was a death that carried a sense of honor, even in disgrace. Swift, symbolic, and often surrounded by ritual, beheading was regarded as the noble death, a way of punishing the powerful, while still acknowledging their place in the order of society. The act itself was simple in design, but dramatic in effect. The condemned would kneel, sometimes on straw or a block, while the executioner prepared the axe or sword. Crowds often gathered, just as they did for hangings, though the atmosphere could be different. Where the gallows might bring jeering and ridicule, a beheading often carried solemnity, with silence or murmurs of respect. The condemned was sometimes allowed a final speech, an opportunity to confess, defend themselves, or appeal to God's mercy. These last words were remembered, repeated, and retold, adding to the moral weight of the event. The role of the executioner in a beheading was critical. A skilled executioner with a sharp blade could end life swiftly, with a single clean stroke. An unskilled or nervous executioner, however, might require multiple blows, turning what should have been a dignified death into a scene of horror. Chronicles tell of bungled executions where the condemned endured 2, 3, or even more strikes before death came. These moments shocked crowds, turning solemn justice into gruesome tragedy, and sometimes led to calls for the executioner to be punished for incompetence. The sharpness of the blade and the steadiness of the hand determined whether the punishment upheld its aura of nobility or collapsed into cruelty. Beheading carried deep symbolic meaning. The head, seen as the seat of thought, soul, and identity, was severed from the body, creating a striking image of justice. In many cases, the head was displayed afterward, placed on spikes or city gates as a warning to others. To see the face of a traitor staring down from above a gate was to feel the presence of justice long after the execution had ended. The body, meanwhile, might be buried separately, reflecting the belief that the crime had fractured the unity of the person. This division of head and body mirrored the division between loyalty and betrayal, between crime and punishment. For nobles, the granting of beheading as a punishment was both a privilege and a final recognition of their status. It was considered swifter and less humiliating than hanging, sparing them the indignity of the rope. In some cases, those of high birth even requested beheading rather than other punishments, believing it a death more fitting to their honor. This reveals much about the medieval worldview. Even in punishment, social hierarchy was preserved. The law was harsh, but it did not erase the distinctions of class and rank that shaped every aspect of life. Famous beheadings captured the imagination of entire nations. Kings, queens, and high lords who lost their heads became symbols of betrayal, tyranny, or martyrdom. Their deaths were remembered in chronicles, ballads, and legends, shaping how people understood both justice and power. The execution of a noble was never just about the individual. It was a political act, a statement about loyalty, authority, and the fragility of power. Each strike of the axe echoed not only in the square but across the realm, reminding all that no one, not even the mighty, was beyond the reach of justice. Religious overtones also colored the act of beheading. Like other executions, it was framed as an opportunity for repentance. Priests urged the condemned to confess, to pray, and to face death with faith. A noble who died bravely, with dignity and piety, could even be admired, their death seen as a form of redemption. On the other hand, one who resisted, cursed, or denied their guilt was taken as a cautionary tale, a sign of damnation. In this way, beheading became not just punishment, but also a lesson, blending justice with morality, power with faith. The memory of beheading lingered not only in chronicles, but in the minds of those who witnessed it. To see a head severed was to see the fragility of life laid bare, to understand in the most vivid terms the power of authority. The clean strike of the axe or sword became a symbol of justice done, swift and undeniable. But it also raised questions about power, fairness, and the costs of loyalty. For medieval people, as for us, the sight of such punishment could never be entirely forgotten. As we move forward, we leave behind the sword and the axe and turn to another execution that carried its own powerful symbolism: burning at the stake. While beheading was reserved for nobles, burning was often used against heretics, witches, and those accused of crimes against faith itself. It was a punishment meant not only to kill but to cleanse, a fiery spectacle that consumed body and soul alike. In the next chapter, we explore the flames that lit medieval squares and the fears that kept them burning. Of all the punishments that marked the medieval imagination, none was more dramatic or terrifying than burning at the stake. Where the gallows represented law and order, and beheading signified honor and nobility, the flames of the stake symbolized spiritual judgment. This punishment was most often reserved for crimes that were believed to endanger not just the body, but the soul itself: heresy, witchcraft, and sometimes treason. To be burned alive was not only to suffer one of the most painful deaths imaginable, but also to serve as a public warning that the boundaries of faith and loyalty could not be crossed without the most dire of consequences. The process of burning was theatrical and deliberate. A wooden stake was erected in a public square or open field, and bundles of wood, straw, and kindling were piled high around it. The condemned was tied to the post, sometimes with chains, sometimes with ropes, their body secured upright for all to see. Crowds gathered, often in great numbers, for such executions were not common everyday events, but extraordinary spectacles that drew people from miles away. Officials announced the crimes, priests urged repentance, and the air was filled with a mixture of fear, fascination, and grim anticipation. For those accused of heresy, the flames carried a particularly symbolic weight. Heresy was not just disobedience to rulers, it was rebellion against the divine order itself. To preach false doctrine, to deny the teachings of the church, or to spread forbidden ideas was seen as a disease of the soul, one that could spread to others if not rooted out. Burning, therefore, was viewed as both punishment and purification. Fire consumed the body, but in the minds of many, it also cleansed the world of the heretic's influence. The crackling flames became a sermon in themselves, teaching the crowd that deviation from faith would be met with holy fire. The experience of burning was horrific. Flames licked at the feet and legs first, climbing upward as the heat and smoke engulfed the body. Death came slowly, through suffocation, shock, or the eventual destruction of vital organs. To watch such a death was to witness agony beyond imagining. Yet for medieval audiences, this suffering was both terrifying and strangely necessary. It reinforced the seriousness of heresy, showing that those who defied the faith risked not only earthly punishment, but eternal damnation. The suffering of one became a warning to all, etched in fire against the backdrop of the community. At times, burning at the stake was combined with ritual. Inquisitors or clergy might offer the condemned a final chance to confess, promising that if they repented, they would be strangled before the flames reached them, sparing them the worst of the agony. Some accepted, seeing death by strangulation as a small mercy. Others refused, defiant to the end, their cries echoing above the roar of the fire. Each choice carried symbolic meaning, shaping how the crowd interpreted the execution. Repentance showed the triumph of the church. Defiance showed the danger of heresy, reinforcing the need for vigilance. Burning was also a political act. It was often used in times of religious turmoil, when rulers sought to demonstrate their loyalty to the faith or to eliminate dissent. The punishment became a tool not only for the church, but also for kings and lords who aligned themselves with religious authority. In this way, the flames symbolized the union of spiritual and temporal power, a dramatic reminder that disobedience to one was disobedience to both. The fire consumed not only the body, but also the identity of the condemned, erasing them from the world in the most visible and final way possible. The memory of burnings lingered long after the flames had died. Stories of heretics who met the fire with courage or despair circulated widely, shaping how communities thought about faith and justice. Some were remembered as martyrs, their deaths inspiring sympathy or even resistance to authority. Others were reviled, their burning seen as a just and necessary act. In either case, the fire became more than punishment. It became narrative, a story retold to children, neighbors, and future generations as part of the moral fabric of society. The symbolism of fire also extended into medieval culture more broadly. Fire was seen as both destructive and purifying, capable of destroying sin while also cleansing the world. To burn a heretic was to declare not only their guilt, but also the community's commitment to purity and unity. The flames rose upward, carrying smoke into the sky, a visible link between earth and heaven, between human justice and divine will. For those who watched, the fire was a reminder that faith was not only belief, but also obedience, and that the cost of disobedience could be paid in fire. While burning at the stake was less common than many other punishments, its impact was enormous. Few who witnessed such an event could ever forget it. The sheer sensory power, the heat, the smoke, the cries ensured that the lesson was burned into memory as deeply as into flesh. In this way, even rare executions by fire shaped medieval culture, reinforcing the boundaries of faith and authority with terrifying clarity. As we step away from the flames, we move into an even more extreme punishment, one that combines spectacle, symbolism, and unimaginable brutality: drawing and quartering. This was the ultimate horror, reserved for the gravest of crimes, particularly treason. In the next chapter, we will explore how this most gruesome of punishments was carried out and what it revealed about loyalty, power, and the lengths to which medieval rulers would go to protect their authority. Among all the punishments devised in the medieval world, few were as feared or as horrific as drawing and quartering. Reserved for the crime of high treason, the ultimate betrayal against king and country, it was a punishment designed not only to end a life, but to obliterate it, to erase the traitor from body to memory. Unlike hanging or burning, which already carried immense terror, drawing and quartering combined multiple stages of humiliation, suffering, and spectacle. It was not simply execution. It was a ritual of destruction, meant to show that betrayal would be met with the harshest justice imaginable. The punishment began with the condemned being drawn, meaning dragged on a wooden hurdle, or sled through the streets to the place of execution. This journey itself was part of the spectacle. Bound and helpless, the traitor was paraded before the people, jeered at and mocked, their body jolting over the cobblestones. The message was clear. Treason was not a private crime, but a public wound, and its punishment would be seen by all. To be dragged in this way stripped the condemned of dignity, reducing them to an object of scorn before the final act had even begun. Once at the execution site, the condemned was hanged, but not to the point of death. Instead, they were suspended until near unconsciousness, then cut down so the next stage could continue. This was followed by mutilation, often castration and disembowelment, acts that symbolized the stripping away of legacy and life. The organs were sometimes burned before the eyes of the condemned, reinforcing the sense of utter destruction. Finally came the beheading, swift compared to the torments that came before, but even death did not end the punishment. The body was quartered, cut into 4 parts, each limb severed and displayed in different parts of the kingdom as a warning. The head was often placed on a spike above city gates, a grim reminder to all who entered that treason would not be tolerated. The sheer brutality of this punishment reveals much about medieval concepts of loyalty and authority. Treason was not merely a crime, it was a tearing of the social fabric, a betrayal that threatened the very survival of the realm. To punish it required not just death, but annihilation, a destruction so complete that it removed the traitor's presence from the community. By scattering body parts across the land, rulers ensured that the warning traveled far and wide, reaching villages and towns that might never have seen the act itself. In this way, the body of the traitor became a message carried by the land itself. For those who witnessed drawing and quartering, the experience was unforgettable. The dragging through the streets, the half-hanging, the mutilation, the quartering, each stage carried its own horror, and together they formed a spectacle that seared itself into memory. Crowds gathered not only to watch, but to participate in the ritual of condemnation, shouting, cheering, and reinforcing the message that betrayal would meet the harshest fate. The punishment became part of communal memory, retold in stories that magnified its terror. Few who heard such tales would ever dream of treachery, for the image of the traitor torn apart was too powerful to ignore. At the same time, the punishment reflected the theatrical nature of medieval justice. Each stage was deliberate, each symbol carefully chosen. The dragging showed humiliation, the half-hanging showed mercy denied, the mutilation showed dishonor, the quartering showed division and destruction. The body was transformed into a canvas upon which loyalty and betrayal were painted in the starkest colors. To medieval audiences, this was not simply cruelty. It was meaning made flesh, justice written in suffering. Religious overtones also infused the act. Just as the church taught that sin divided the soul, so treason divided the body. The scattering of limbs symbolized the shattering of loyalty, the destruction of unity. Priests were sometimes present, urging repentance, but the overwhelming message was not one of salvation, but of warning. The traitor's soul was left to God, but their body was claimed by the state, torn apart as a lesson for all. The memory of drawing and quartering has endured through history, perhaps more vividly than many other punishments. Its sheer extremity ensured that it would never be forgotten. Though rare, it captured the imagination in ways that ordinary hangings or floggings never could. It became a symbol of ultimate justice, ultimate terror, and ultimate authority, a punishment that showed the lengths rulers would go to protect their power. Even today, the phrase itself evokes horror, a testament to how deeply it etched itself into cultural memory. As we move beyond this most terrible of punishments, we turn to a different focus: the everyday crimes of medieval life and the punishments they provoked. While treason demanded annihilation, theft, the most common of all crimes, brought its own harsh penalties. In the next chapter, we will explore how medieval society dealt with thieves, from the loss of hands to the gallows, and what these punishments reveal about the importance of property and survival in a world where every possession mattered. Of all the crimes that medieval people feared, theft was among the most common and most disruptive. In a world where possessions were few and survival often depended on a handful of tools, livestock, or a sack of grain, the loss of property could mean hunger, ruin, or even death. To steal was not only to break the law, but to threaten the fragile balance of a community. Because of this, theft was punished with particular severity. While modern societies often treat theft with fines or imprisonment, medieval justice made theft into a spectacle of suffering and shame, ranging from amputations to executions. One of the most common punishments for theft was the cutting off of a hand. The symbolism was simple and powerful. The hand that had taken what was not its own would be taken in return. The punishment was not only physical but moral, turning the thief's body into a permanent reminder of their crime. A person missing a hand was instantly recognizable as a thief, marked for life and forever separated from full trust in the community. This punishment also carried practical consequences, for the loss of a hand made work more difficult and survival more precarious. In this way, the sentence extended long beyond the moment of amputation. In other cases, thieves might lose ears, noses, or even be branded with hot irons, each mark declaring their guilt for all to see. Branding a thief's forehead or cheek ensured that their crime was visible in every interaction, a scar that could never be hidden. These punishments reflected a society where written records were scarce, and where reputation was carried in the body itself. To punish through mutilation or branding was to create living records of wrongdoing, ensuring that even years later, a thief's crime could not be forgotten. But the punishments did not stop at mutilation. For repeated thefts or for particularly valuable crimes, execution was often the outcome. Hanging was the most common method, though in some regions, thieves might be drowned, burned, or otherwise put to death. The gallows became a frequent destination for those who were caught stealing again and again, their bodies left on display as a warning to others. The message was clear. Theft was not merely mischief, but a direct threat to survival, and society would tolerate no mercy for those who endangered it repeatedly. Public humiliation also played a role in punishing theft. Thieves might be placed in the stocks or pillory, exposed to the ridicule of neighbors, sometimes with the stolen goods displayed around their necks. A baker caught short-changing customers might be paraded through town with loaves of bread tied to his body, while a petty thief could be forced to confess their crime aloud as the crowd mocked them. These punishments, while less violent than mutilation or execution, could still destroy a person's reputation and standing. making reintegration into the community nearly impossible. The harshness of these punishments reflected not only the seriousness with which theft was regarded, but also the fragility of medieval life. In an age without banks, insurance, or large reserves, every item carried weight. A stolen chicken meant fewer eggs. A stolen plow meant fields could not be sown. A stolen coin might mean no food for the winter. Theft threatened survival, and so it was treated with the utmost severity. Punishment was not just about correcting the individual, but about sending a message to the community. Survival depended on order, and order could not exist if theft were allowed to spread. Religious meaning also shaped these punishments. The church taught that theft was a sin against both neighbor and God, a violation of the commandment against stealing. To mutilate or execute a thief was not only to protect the community, but also to enforce divine law. Priests often urged thieves to confess and repent before punishment, emphasizing the salvation of the soul even as the body was destroyed. In this way, theft was framed not merely as a legal offense, but as a moral corruption that needed cleansing through suffering. Despite the severity of the punishments, theft remained common, for poverty was widespread and desperation often pushed people to steal. Chronicles and records show countless examples of poor peasants, hungry children, or desperate families caught taking food or goods to survive. The harshness of the punishments did little to eliminate theft, but served instead to remind communities of the dangers of hunger, poverty, and inequality. In many ways, the spectacle of punishing thieves was as much about reinforcing social order as it was about deterring crime. The punishment of thieves reveals a great deal about the priorities of medieval society. Property, though meager by modern standards, was precious, and the survival of individuals and families depended upon it. To steal was to attack not just a person, but the entire community, for the ripple effects of loss could be devastating. This is why punishment was so harsh, so visible, and so symbolic. It reminded all who saw it that theft was not to be tolerated, for the survival of all depended upon the honesty and trust of each member. As we move on from theft, we enter the world of witchcraft, another crime that carried punishments of fire and death. While theft threatened survival and property, witchcraft threatened the soul and the spiritual order. In the next chapter, we will explore how fear of witches and magic shaped medieval punishments, leading to some of the most infamous and tragic episodes in history. Of all the crimes that haunted the medieval imagination, witchcraft stood apart as one of the most feared. Unlike theft, which endangered property, or treason, which threatened rulers, witchcraft was believed to endanger the very souls of communities. To accuse someone of practicing magic was to accuse them of aligning with dark forces, of inviting the devil himself into the daily lives of ordinary people. Fear of witches blended with fear of famine, disease, and disaster, creating a powerful belief that those who wielded forbidden powers must be punished with the utmost severity. As a result, the punishments for witchcraft were among the harshest, with fire becoming the most common method of supposed purification. The origins of witchcraft accusations often lay in suspicion, envy, or unexplained misfortune. A neighbor's cow stopped giving milk, a child fell ill, a storm ruined crops, and someone needed to be blamed. In tight-knit communities, where everyone's survival depended on fragile balances, the slightest disruption could ignite suspicion. Women, particularly those living alone, those who practiced herbal healing, or those who stood outside the norms of society, were frequent targets. Once accused, escape was rare, for witchcraft was seen not merely as wrongdoing, but as a pact with evil. No defense could easily counter such a charge. Trials for witchcraft were often elaborate affairs, shaped as much by fear as by evidence. Accused witches might be subjected to ordeals, such as being thrown into water to see if they floated, an inversion of natural order thought to reveal guilt. Others were examined for witches' marks, small blemishes or scars believed to be signs of a pact with the devil. Confessions were frequently extracted under torture, with the rack, thumbscrews, or other devices used to force admissions. Once a confession was obtained, the sentence was usually death, most often by burning at the stake. The fire was seen not only as destruction, but also as cleansing, consuming both the body and the supposed evil within it. The act of burning witches was deeply symbolic. Fire was believed to purify, to scourge away sin and corruption. Just as metals were purified in flame, so too was the community purified by the destruction of witches. The flames consumed not only the accused, but also the fear they represented, offering reassurance to onlookers that evil had been defeated. Crowds gathered in large numbers for such executions, for the fear of witchcraft was communal, and its eradication was seen as a collective victory. The cries of the condemned, the rising smoke, and the smell of burning wood and flesh became part of the sensory memory of justice, a vivid and terrifying reminder of the costs of dealing with dark forces. The fear of witchcraft also reflected deeper anxieties of medieval life. Disease, famine, and natural disasters struck without warning, and in the absence of scientific explanation, supernatural causes seemed the only answer. Witches became scapegoats for misfortune, embodying the anxieties of communities struggling to survive. Punishing witches was a way of restoring order, of showing that chaos and evil could be controlled. In this sense, the trials and executions were not only acts of punishment, but rituals of reassurance, binding communities together through shared belief in the triumph of good over evil. It is important to note that not all accused witches were burned. In some regions, hanging or drowning was used instead. Yet the image of fire remained the most powerful, shaping both contemporary fears and later memories of the period. The association of witches with flames became so strong that it endures even in modern imagination, where witches and burning stakes are inseparable. This shows the enduring power of symbolism in medieval justice, where the method of punishment mattered as much as the act itself. The punishment of witchcraft also highlights the role of gender in medieval society. Women were far more likely to be accused, reflecting both their vulnerable position and the suspicion directed at those who lived outside traditional roles. Widows, healers, midwives, and outspoken women were often targeted, their independence seen as threatening in a patriarchal world. The punishment of witches thus reinforced not only religious and social order, but also gender hierarchies, reminding all of their place within the structure of medieval life. The legacy of witchcraft trials and punishments has endured long after the Middle Ages. Tales of witches burned at the stake became part of folklore, shaping fears and stories for generations. Even centuries later, during the great witch hunts of early modern Europe, the medieval roots of fear and fire remained strong. The spectacle of burning witches continued to serve as a reminder of the dangers of deviation, the fragility of social order, and the terrifying power of belief. As we leave behind the flames of witchcraft trials, we turn to another crime that struck at the heart of medieval loyalty: treason. If witchcraft represented rebellion against God, treason represented rebellion against rulers. Both were seen as threats to the very foundation of society, and both were punished with exceptional severity. In the next chapter, we explore the punishments for treason, acts that revealed how deeply medieval people feared betrayal and how far they would go to enforce loyalty. If there was one crime that medieval rulers feared above all others, it was treason. To steal from a neighbor was dangerous. To spread heresy was threatening. But to betray one's lord or sovereign was to tear at the very fabric of power that held society together. Treason was not merely disobedience. It was betrayal, an act that struck at the heart of loyalty, honor, and stability. Because of this, the punishments for treason were among the most brutal and theatrical of the Middle Ages, designed to obliterate the traitor both in body and in memory, while leaving a lasting message for all who witnessed the spectacle. Treason came in many forms. It might be plotting against a king, aiding an enemy in times of war, or conspiring to overthrow a lord. Sometimes it was as simple as failing to fulfill an oath of loyalty, for in the medieval world, oaths were sacred bonds. To break them was not only to betray one's ruler, but to defy God, who was believed to witness every promise. Treason was therefore seen as both a crime and a sin, a double offense against the order of earth and heaven. Its punishment had to match its enormity. The punishments for treason varied depending on the status of the accused. Nobles might be executed by beheading, considered a more honorable death, but even then, the ritual was designed to strip away dignity. The condemned were paraded through the streets, displayed as symbols of disgrace. Their estates and titles were often confiscated, leaving their families in ruin. In this way, punishment extended beyond the body of the traitor to destroy their legacy, ensuring that the betrayal was punished across generations. The dishonor of treason stained not only the individual, but their name, their house, and all who bore their blood. For commoners, the punishment was far harsher. Drawing and quartering, with all its horror, was most often reserved for traitors, as described in an earlier chapter. To be dragged through the streets, mutilated, and torn into pieces was the ultimate declaration that betrayal would not be tolerated. The scattering of body parts served as both symbol and warning, ensuring that no village, no road, no marketplace could forget the price of treason. The traitor's body became a lesson carved into the very geography of the kingdom. The theater of treason punishments was deliberate. Rulers understood that the public needed to see justice carried out, that the betrayal of one could inspire others, unless it was answered with overwhelming severity. Executions for treason often drew enormous crowds, not merely because of curiosity, but because of the weight of the crime. The community needed to see the betrayal punished, to feel that order had been restored. The punishment became a ritual of reassurance, a declaration that loyalty remained the bedrock of society and that betrayal would be met with blood. Treason also carried profound religious symbolism. To betray one's lord was often compared to betraying Christ, the ultimate act of disloyalty. Executioners and priests alike framed the punishment of traitors in spiritual terms, warning that betrayal led not only to earthly torment, but to eternal damnation. The punishment was meant to cleanse the world of corruption, to sever the diseased branch from the tree of society. In this sense, the blood of traitors was not only justice but sacrifice, offered to preserve the health of the community. The memory of traitors was carefully managed. Chronicles recorded their downfall, songs and stories retold their betrayal, and their names were often cursed or erased. In some cases, the dishonor extended so far that even burial in consecrated ground was denied. To die as a traitor was to be excluded not only from society, but from eternity itself. This erasure ensured that loyalty was remembered as the highest virtue and betrayal as the gravest sin. The punishment of treason reveals how deeply medieval society depended on bonds of loyalty. In a world without centralized power, where rulers relied on the oaths of lords, knights, and subjects, betrayal threatened collapse. To deter treason, punishments had to be extreme, public, and unforgettable. They were acts of destruction, not only of the body, but of honor, legacy, and memory. The execution of a traitor was not just an ending, it was a statement to all who remained that loyalty was sacred and betrayal would bring ruin. As we move on from the blood and spectacle of treason, we turn to another form of punishment that shaped medieval life: imprisonment. While today, prison is a common punishment, in the Middle Ages it was far less widespread, often used not as a final sentence, but as a holding place or a supplement to harsher justice. In the next chapter, we explore the dark world of medieval dungeons and cells, where punishment took the form of confinement, neglect, and often hidden torment. When we think of punishment today, prison is often the first image that comes to mind. Yet in the medieval world, imprisonment was not the standard response to crime. Building and maintaining prisons required resources, guards, and supplies, things that many communities simply could not spare. For this reason, imprisonment was usually temporary, a place to hold the accused until trial, or the convicted until execution. Still, when dungeons and cells were used as punishment, they carried their own weight of fear, for confinement in the medieval world often meant darkness, neglect, and quiet suffering away from the eyes of the community. The image of the medieval dungeon has been shaped by countless stories and legends: cold stone walls, chains rattling in the dark, straw-covered floors crawling with vermin. While not every prison matched these images, many were indeed grim places. Cells were often carved into the foundations of castles or towers, damp and poorly ventilated. Prisoners might go for days without light, their only company the sound of dripping water and the scurrying of rats. Food was meager, often little more than stale bread and water, and illness spread quickly in the confined, filthy spaces. To be imprisoned was not simply to lose freedom. It was to be cast into a slow decay of body and spirit. In many cases, imprisonment was combined with neglect or even deliberate cruelty. Shackles bound prisoners to walls, limiting their movement to only a few feet. Chains grew heavy on the skin, rubbing sores into wrists and ankles. Cold draughts pierced the body, and disease crept through the darkness. Without the spectacle of public punishment, imprisonment worked by breaking down the spirit in silence. The loneliness, the endless hours, the absence of human connection, all wore away at the prisoner. Many emerged from dungeons, not only weakened in body, but transformed in mind, scarred by isolation as much as by chains. Some prisons were also sites of torture. While flogging and execution were carried out publicly, torture was often hidden, used to extract confessions or information. The dungeon provided the perfect stage for such acts. There, away from the eyes of the community, interrogators could apply their tools: the rack, the thumbscrews, or other devices designed to inflict pain until the prisoner yielded. For rulers and inquisitors, torture was not only a means of discovering truth, but also a way of exerting control, reminding the prisoner that resistance was useless. To be thrown into such a place was to enter a realm where justice and cruelty blurred. Yet imprisonment was not always so extreme. In some towns and cities, jails functioned more like holding cells, where prisoners awaited trial or punishment. These were often overseen by local sheriffs or officials, and might include both criminals and debtors. Debtors' prisons, in particular, became common, holding those who could not repay what they owed until their families raised the money. For these prisoners, confinement was not about pain, but about pressure forcing repayment through the threat of ongoing captivity. Even so, the conditions were often harsh, for comfort was not a priority in the medieval understanding of justice. The symbolism of imprisonment was powerful. To be cast into a dungeon was to be removed from the light of the community, from the bonds of daily life. It was a form of social death, isolating the individual from family, neighbors, and even from God's world of sky and sun. The darkness itself became punishment, erasing the prisoner from sight. For medieval people who lived in close-knit communities where reputation and belonging were everything, this erasure carried immense weight. It was not simply the loss of freedom, but the loss of identity, of place in the world. Despite its limited use, imprisonment began to evolve during the later Middle Ages. As cities grew and central authorities gained strength, prisons became more organized, with designated buildings and systems of oversight. Still, they retained their grim reputation, places associated with darkness, despair, and hidden suffering. Unlike the spectacle of hanging or the fire of the stake, imprisonment left no vivid public display. Instead, it worked through silence, absence, and the slow erosion of the human spirit. The dungeon also became a powerful image in medieval imagination and later folklore. Tales of knights imprisoned in towers, of captives languishing in cells, of noble prisoners plotting escape all became part of the cultural memory of the Middle Ages. These stories, whether exaggerated or not, reinforced the fear of confinement and the association of dungeons with cruelty and despair. To be locked away was to vanish from the world, to become a shadow in the dark. As we leave the dungeons behind, we turn to a very different form of punishment, one that was not about darkness or pain, but about spiritual correction. Not all punishments in the medieval world were violent. Some were penances designed to bring the sinner closer to God, to cleanse the soul rather than the body. In the next chapter, we explore religious penances where prayer, pilgrimage, and even self-inflicted suffering became tools of justice and redemption. Not all punishments in the medieval world were marked by blood, fire, or iron. Many were shaped instead by the Church, which sought to guide souls back to God through acts of penance. Where secular punishments emphasized pain, humiliation, or death, ecclesiastical punishments often emphasized repentance, discipline, and spiritual correction. Yet even here, suffering and endurance played central roles. Pilgrimages, fasts, and even self-inflicted whippings were imposed as sentences meant to cleanse sin and restore balance between the individual and the divine. In this way, punishment extended beyond the body into the realm of the soul, reminding all that justice was not only about law, but also about salvation. One of the most common religious punishments was the pilgrimage. A sinner might be ordered to journey to a holy shrine, sometimes hundreds of miles away, as a way of atoning for wrongdoing. Pilgrimages were arduous, demanding long travel on foot, exposure to the elements, and reliance on the charity of strangers. For those sent as penance, the hardship itself was the punishment. Every step became an act of repentance, every blister a reminder of sin. To travel to Santiago de Compostela, Canterbury, or Rome was not only to endure hardship, but to seek forgiveness at holy sites, reinforcing the belief that penance could bring both earthly reconciliation and eternal grace. Confession and fasting were also used as punishments. To confess one's sins publicly before a congregation was deeply humiliating, stripping away pride and forcing acknowledgement of guilt. Fasting denied the body its daily comforts, reminding the sinner of both discipline and dependence on God's mercy. In a society where food was central to survival, to go without it by order of the Church was a punishment that resonated deeply, reminding all that sin carried real and tangible consequences. These punishments, while less dramatic than execution, carried their own weight, shaping behavior through shame and deprivation. Flagellation, whipping oneself or being whipped by others, was another form of religious penance. Unlike secular flogging, which sought to discipline through force, religious flagellation was framed as purification. Monks and lay people alike sometimes engaged in voluntary self-flagellation, believing that suffering cleansed the soul and drew them closer to Christ, who had suffered on the cross. As punishment, flagellation could be imposed by church authorities, forcing sinners to endure pain as a reminder of their failings and as a visible act of repentance. The blood that flowed was not only a mark of discipline, but a symbol of purification, an earthly mirror of the sacrifice of Christ. Public penance carried particular importance in the medieval world. To kneel before the congregation, to stand barefoot in the cold outside a church, or to wear sackcloth and ashes as signs of humility, all were ways of showing the community that sin was acknowledged and repentance underway. This restored the social order, reassuring neighbors that justice had been served and that the sinner had begun the path back to God's grace. In this sense, religious penances served both the spiritual and social needs of the community, balancing mercy with discipline. For many, these punishments were not less harsh than physical mutilation or the gallows. The humiliation of public confession, the exhaustion of long pilgrimages, and the pain of the lash cut deeply into the human spirit. Yet unlike secular punishments, they carried hope. Penance was not designed to destroy, but to heal, to reintegrate the sinner into the community, and restore their place in both society and heaven. In this way, religious punishments reflected the Church's vision of justice. Not simply retribution, but redemption. At the same time, penances reinforced the authority of the Church. To control not only the body, but the soul was to wield ultimate power, and the Church's ability to impose spiritual punishments reminded all that sin was not only a private matter, but a public concern. To refuse penance was to risk excommunication, a punishment even more feared than death, for it cut the sinner off from the sacraments and from the hope of salvation. In this way, penances served as both discipline and warning, shaping not only the behavior of individuals, but the beliefs of entire communities. The use of penances shows that medieval justice was never purely about pain or spectacle. It was about balance between punishment and forgiveness, between sin and grace, between the needs of society and the demands of faith. To walk barefoot on a long pilgrimage road, to kneel in ashes, or to endure the sting of the whip was to participate in a system that sought not only to deter crime, but to heal souls. This blending of justice and spirituality made medieval punishments deeply complex, rooted in both fear and hope. As we move forward, we turn to yet another form of punishment, one that was neither death nor penance, but humiliation through ridicule. Public shame delivered through masks, mocking rituals, and theatrical displays became a powerful tool of justice, shaping reputations and reinforcing community order. In the next chapter, we explore how shame itself became a weapon, leaving scars as deep as any blade. In a world where reputation was as valuable as coin, public shame was one of the most effective punishments of the medieval era. Unlike mutilation or execution, which destroyed the body, shaming destroyed a person's standing within their community. To be mocked, ridiculed, and laughed at in public was to suffer a wound that cut deep into one's honor, a wound that could linger for a lifetime. Medieval justice made frequent use of such punishments, turning ridicule itself into a weapon of authority and order. Public shaming took many forms. Sometimes it meant being placed in the stocks or pillory, exposed to the jeers of neighbors and strangers alike. Other times, it involved being paraded through the streets while wearing humiliating clothing or objects that symbolized the crime. A man caught gossiping might be forced to wear a bridle-like contraption called a scold's bridle or brank, which clamped over the mouth and prevented speech. A woman accused of being quarrelsome could be made to wear a horned cap, marking her as a nagging wife. These punishments were theatrical, transforming the wrongdoer into a living symbol of their offense. Mocking masks and costumes were especially common. These grotesque items exaggerated features, turning the punished into figures of ridicule. A thief might wear a mask shaped like an animal known for cunning, while adulterers could be paraded with horns on their heads, symbolizing betrayal. By transforming the accused into a caricature, the punishment invited laughter and scorn, ensuring that their shame would be remembered long after the event. The crowd's laughter was not only entertainment, it was part of the justice itself, reinforcing community values by ridiculing those who broke them. Verbal humiliation also played a role. Offenders might be forced to stand in a public place and confess their crimes aloud, repeating words dictated by officials. The act of speaking won his own guilt before the crowd stripped away dignity and forced submission to authority. In some cases, offenders were made to beg forgiveness from their victims in public, kneeling or prostrating themselves as onlookers watched. These rituals of humiliation reminded all that honor could be restored only through acknowledgement of fault and the acceptance of communal judgment. Public shaming could also involve physical discomfort, though its purpose was less about pain than about visibility. Offenders might be forced to carry heavy stones through town, to wear chains around their necks, or to walk barefoot across rough ground. These tasks turned punishment into performance, each step watched by the community, each gesture reinforcing guilt. The humiliation of being seen in such a state was often worse than the physical strain, for it was the loss of reputation that cut deepest. The effectiveness of public shame lay in the communal nature of medieval life. In small towns and villages, everyone knew one another, and a damaged reputation could mean exclusion from trade, mistrust in agreements, or even difficulties in marriage. To be laughed at by one's neighbors, to have one's dignity stripped away in public, was to risk long-term consequences that went beyond the moment of punishment. The laughter of the crowd lingered, echoing in memory long after the punishment had ended. Yet, like many medieval punishments, shaming carried symbolic meaning as well. To wear horns was to embody betrayal. To be silenced by a brink was to display the corruption of the tongue. To be paraded in rags was to show the degradation of dishonor. These punishments were moral lessons as much as they were penalties, teaching through spectacle and ridicule. They reminded the community not only of the crime, but of the values that had been violated, reinforcing the moral fabric of society through mockery. In some cases, public shame served as an alternative to harsher punishments. Instead of mutilation or execution, a first-time offender might be humiliated, with the understanding that repeated offenses would bring greater severity. This flexibility allowed communities to balance mercy with deterrence, using laughter and ridicule to discipline without bloodshed. Still, for those who endured it, the humiliation could be devastating, leaving scars of dishonor that never fully healed. Public shame reveals a softer side of medieval punishment compared to the gallows or the rack, but it was no less powerful. It shows how deeply medieval society valued reputation, how honor was both currency and identity. To strip someone of honor through ridicule was to strike at the heart of who they were. It was a punishment that relied not on the lash or the sword, but on the eyes, voices, and laughter of the community itself. As we move to the final chapter, we step back to consider how all of these punishments, whether violent, symbolic, or humiliating, reflected the beliefs and values of the Middle Ages. Together, they paint a portrait of a society where justice was inseparable from spectacle, where fear and faith shaped every penalty, and where punishment revealed as much about the people who imposed it as about those who endured it. As we have journeyed through the many punishments of the medieval world, a pattern emerges. Whether through fire or rope, whip or ridicule, branding or pilgrimage, each punishment was more than just a response to crime. It was an expression of belief. Punishment in the Middle Ages was not simply about deterring wrongdoing. It was about reinforcing the values that held society together, values rooted in religion, hierarchy, and the constant struggle for survival. To understand medieval punishments is to understand how deeply intertwined justice was with the worldview of the time. One of the clearest themes is the role of religion. Nearly every punishment, from ordeals of fire and water to the burning of heretics, was framed within a spiritual context. Crime was seen not only as a violation of human law, but as a sin against God. To suffer was to purify, to endure pain was to cleanse, and to confess was to heal the soul. Even executions were accompanied by priests urging repentance, reminding both the condemned and the crowd that eternal salvation remained at stake. The medieval mind could not separate crime from sin, or punishment from penance. Justice was not just about order on earth, but about preparing souls for judgment in heaven. Another defining feature was spectacle. Punishments were rarely hidden. They were performed in marketplaces, crossroads, and open fields, where as many people as possible could see. The gallows, the stocks, the stake-all were stages upon which justice was displayed as theater. This reliance on spectacle reveals how justice was meant to educate, frighten, and unify. A hanging did not just remove a thief. It taught every onlooker that crime would not be tolerated. A flogging did not just punish an offender. It etched fear into the minds of neighbors. In this way, punishment was as much about the crowd as it was about the condemned. Justice became a communal experience, reinforcing shared values through the sight of suffering. Hierarchy also shaped punishments. Nobles might be beheaded, their deaths swift and honorable, while commoners swung from the gallows or endured mutilation. The wealthy could sometimes pay fines instead of enduring harsher sentences, while the poor bore the full brunt of physical punishment. Even in death, social distinctions remained. Punishment was not blind, it was a reflection of one's place in the order of society. This reveals how justice was not only about crime, but about reinforcing the structures of power, reminding everyone of their position and the consequences of stepping out of line. Fear played a central role as well. Medieval life was precarious, threatened constantly by famine, disease, war, and disorder. In such a world, anything that threatened stability was treated with severity. Theft endangered survival. Heresy endangered souls, treason endangered kingdoms. Punishment responded with force, not because people delighted in cruelty, but because they feared chaos. Every lash of the whip, every body left hanging, every flame consuming a heretic was meant to hold back the ever-present fear of collapse. Punishment was harsh because life was harsh, and justice was one of the few tools people believed could preserve order. At the same time, not all punishments were violent. Religious penances, pilgrimages, and public confessions show that mercy and redemption were part of the system too. These punishments emphasized restoration rather than destruction, reminding sinners that they could return to the fold through repentance and discipline. Even in the shadow of the gallows, there was room for forgiveness, reflecting the medieval belief that no soul was beyond saving if it turned back to God. The punishments also reveal the medieval fascination with symbolism. Every act carried meaning beyond the moment. Cutting off a hand declared the theft ended forever. Burning a body declared heresy purged. Forcing someone into the stocks declared shame as a visible mark. Each punishment was a message, written in flesh, fire, or ridicule, for all to read. This reliance on symbolism ensured that justice lingered not only in memory, but in imagination, shaping how communities understood morality itself. Looking back now, we may see these punishments as cruel or barbaric, yet to medieval people, they made sense within their world. They were responses to real fears, shaped by real beliefs, enacted in a society where survival was fragile and faith was central. To study these punishments is to see how justice is never only about law, it is always about culture, belief, and power. Medieval punishments reflected the world that created them, a world of hierarchy, faith, fear, and spectacle. As our exploration draws to a close, we can see that medieval punishments, in all their variety, were more than relics of a violent age. They were windows into the values of a society that sought order in chaos, meaning in suffering, and justice in the blending of the earthly and the divine. They remind us that punishment is never just about crime, it is about who we are, what we fear, and what we believe is necessary to hold our world together. As we come to the end of this long journey through the punishments of the medieval world, we can see that justice in those times was never simple. It was harsh and symbolic, brutal and deeply meaningful, shaped by faith, fear, and the fragile balance of survival. Every punishment, whether a simple act of humiliation in the stocks or the horror of the gallows and stake, reflected a society striving to maintain order in a world that often felt unpredictable and dangerous. These punishments may shock us today, but they also remind us of how profoundly different life once was, and how much the past can teach us about the values and fears of people who lived centuries ago. If you've made it this far, I hope this exploration has given you not only a clearer understanding of medieval punishments, but also a sense of the culture and beliefs that shaped them. Perhaps in drifting through these stories, you've found a measure of calm as the weight of history settles around you like a quiet blanket, reminding us all that every age faces its own struggles, and every society creates its own ways of coping with them. Before we finish, I'd love to invite you once again to subscribe to this channel, History for Sleep, By subscribing, you will always be able to return to these stories whenever you need them, whether it is to learn, to relax, or simply to let your mind wander as you rest. And if you'd like, leave a comment below telling me what part of history most interests you, and when you enjoy listening most, whether it's at night as you fall asleep, in the morning as you prepare for the day, or during moments of quiet reflection. Your thoughts not only guide the stories I share, but also help shape this community of listeners who find comfort in the past. Thank you for spending this time with me, and may the echoes of history carry you gently toward rest. Until the next story, sleep well.